Welcome everyone, and really excited that you're here to share this time with two of my favorite alumni. Really a treat to have them both together, and really a treat to have them back in the upstate New York area, really close to us. Pretty excited. So I want to introduce you to both of them. Lexi Andrus graduated from Hartwick in 2008 with a major in biology and minors in geology and chemistry. She is now working for Evotec in the business development team. This position acts as a liaison between those business developers operating in the field and internal teams, such as marketing, operations, and lead generation. In addition, she operates as a qualifier for customer requests, looking to understand their scientific needs and determining if the company can meet those needs based on capacity, cost, and expertise. Lexi previously worked for Evotec as a lab scientist in the assay operations team. And our second guest is Jon Paczkowski, who graduated from Hartwick in 2008 with a major in biology. He is currently a research scientist at the Wadsworth Center, part of the New York State Department of Health. He currently runs an infectious disease lab studying how bacteria communicate to coordinate infections. He is also an assistant professor in the biomedical sciences department at the University at Albany, where he lectures at the graduate level on microbial signal transduction and structural biology techniques. So it's just such a pleasure to be here with you guys on this digital screen. It's really exciting to see you and to be able to hear you and hear you share your experiences. So we're going to get started with our first question. Can you both please tell us a little bit about your path from Hartwick to your current position? Jon, you're on mute.
There we go. I'll start first since I had a very traditional pathway. So immediately after I graduated from Hartwick, I enrolled in the biochemistry and molecular cell biology PhD program at Cornell University, where I joined Chris Ferrami's lab and learned how to become a biochemist and an X-ray crystallographer. I graduated in 2014 and subsequently moved to Princeton University to take a postdoctoral fellowship with world-renowned scientist Bonnie Bassler, who studies quorum sensing, which is how bacteria communicate to coordinate infections. And so that was a really great once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I obtained a national fellowship scholarship, basically pay my stipend and to fund my research while in her lab. And I was there until 2019 when I went on the job market looking for faculty positions. And I stumbled across the job posting at the Wadsworth Center, which, despite being a lifelong New Yorker, didn't know existed. It's a fundamental basic research lab that's funded by the Department of Health. And it's basically a joint faculty position at SUNY Albany. And so I was able to continue my research that I started in Bonnie's lab here in Albany. And it's been a year or 9 months since that started, with a little bit of a hiccup due to the lockdown. But so things are finally starting to get underway.
And so while Jon was doing all of that, I had my own little bit more windy path. So after Hartwick, I continued to get a master's degree at Binghamton University in microbial genetics under Dr. Matthew Parker. And actually through that, I was able to travel and do sample collection, so always more travel involved. From there, I moved up to Ithaca to join Jon and moved into food. So I actually spent a year being an artisan baker in sourdough, so very, very involved with the microbial community. From that position, I actually transitioned directly into food quality and food safety at Cornell University in the Milk Quality Improvement Lab, where I worked on the genetics of spore-forming bacteria, as well as food safety in small artisan cheese plants, training small cheesemakers how to sample their plant for safety purposes. From there, then Jon and I moved to Princeton, where I took a position in an R&D lab at Inifas and worked on chemical leavening in the bakery department. And again, from there, also spent another year being an artisan baker under a female business owner with a female-run staff. So I really enjoyed that. And from there, I actually transitioned back into the lab as an assay scientist, where I learned many new techniques that I'd actually never used as a geneticist at Binghamton and at Hartwick, and also learned a little bit of cell culture. And when we decided to come up here for Jon's position at the Wadsworth, I actually transitioned to the business development team. And I actually feel like as part of the business development team, I have to learn more science than I did as a bench scientist, because I am constantly talking to people who have different needs throughout all different parts of biology and chemistry. So every day I'm learning a new technique that somebody's in need of, and meeting a new operations scientist who's performing that work somewhere across the world.
That's really exciting. It's neat that the jobs keep changing, growing for you guys.
A lot more for me, but nothing wrong with that.
So another question for you guys. How has this pandemic impacted your work? And do you see some of the adjustments becoming standard practices?
Well, Jon just got sent home. So I actually work remotely all of the time, since we've moved to Albany. And in that respect, everything's the same, except the internet's terrible now. But a lot of my focus was working on events where we could really get to know people who needed work done, so networking events. And now obviously we've gone completely virtual, just like this event. And also the need for my company's services is even greater now. We do a lot of work that helps support COVID research, and a lot of the big pharmaceutical companies and smaller biotechs actually have had to shut down during the pandemic, and our laboratories all over the world have kept running throughout it. So we're actually just as busy as we were before.
Yeah, so my personal research changed quite significantly because I was sent home for 10 weeks and not allowed to enter my lab. So the unique thing about my research lab and where the Wadsworth is located is that it is the preeminent public health service, basically in the United States. Sometimes the CDC actually sends samples to us. So we are the largest health organization in the United States, essentially. And they are committed to carrying out tens of thousands of tests for COVID a day. And so one of the concerns was not only did they need to reduce the population of people who are in the laboratory, they also needed to ensure that all the resources that we have in the building were going directly towards testing actual viral load samples, and also developing antibody tests for testing people who may have previously been infected with COVID. So, all of us had to make this sort of sacrifice, even though we probably could have safely returned to work much earlier, but we needed to ensure that, public safety and public health were at the forefront of our mission. So we needed to be able to carry out all of those tests. And so as a result, there was no basic research being done. And now that we've returned as part of the phased reopening of New York State, we have had to take several precautions in order for the governor to allow us to remain open. We have to have our temperatures checked daily. We have to wear a mask everywhere in the building, unless you are in an office by yourself. We have reduced certain research positions, hours, or timing of those positions, such that there's a lower density of people within my lab at any given time. And basically trying to keep 6 feet apart at all times, which is difficult when you're trying to do science with people and train them. But ultimately, I think that these are measures that we're always going to have to maintain to a certain level until, there's a vaccine. So it's the reality.
Yeah, thanks. It's interesting how I think so many different, it's so many things are the same, the masks and the distancing, and so many things are different depending on what we were doing before, right, as a company. And what services we were providing. So another question, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself while a student at Hartwick? Has this advice shifted at all since COVID-19?
I said for me, it hasn't really changed.
Yeah.
Be flexible and open to new experiences. While most of my job is very similar to what it was before, I have to, immediately shift and be open to exploring all different types of things. And the same came for my career path. I was always open to, exploring a new avenue or, learning a new technique. And that kind of led me to where I am right now. I'd also say, visit your parents more.
For me, I would say, unrelated to COVID, my advice to my younger self would have been to seek out more in research opportunities when I was an undergrad. I did the Hartwick experience. I did research during the semester, but I wish I had spent my summers better taking out opportunities, interacting with alumni, trying to find opportunities for research. It's just something I didn't really think about, and I definitely felt like I was a little bit behind the 8 ball when I was in grad school, and it took me about a year or so to catch up. So, now that I'm looking at applications for students as part of like an admissions committee, that's just something that a lot of people are doing now, and I wish it was something I had done. And yeah, that obviously hasn't changed since COVID.
That's sort of the same. It's sort of weird is it weird to look back at yourselves in
Yeah.
those years? So how prepared do you think your field, sort of where you're working, the field you're working in, was to adjust to the economic and social impacts of COVID-19? How ready did your field feel?
Oh, yeah. That's an interesting question for me because my field is actually directly related to COVID. So yeah, I think one of the things that stood out to me most was the virus test that New York State actually ended up running. So we started having cases in New York State in early to mid-February, at least confirmed cases. It was probably here much earlier than that. But the tests that were initially being run weren't very good. We were having a lot of false positives, false negative rate was too high. And so New York State scientists actually developed a test within 2 weeks and had it approved by the FDA in a couple days. So I think that the infrastructure that we have in our facilities here in New York are actually really great in being able to prepare for health crises such as the one we experienced in February. And ultimately, I think that New York State responded as well as we could in terms of the resources that we had at the time and what we knew at the time.
And in terms of, pharma, like the pharma industry and biotechs, I'd say that some are ultimately the most prepared. They've been waiting. They have drugs in their pipeline. They've had drugs they've developed for other things, and so they're developing things for secondary infections. And then there's some that aren't prepared. They're not even prepared to make a safety plan to have people continue to work. And so I think there's going to be like this big shakeout from people who've kind of had this in mind. We're in an industry that's tracking disease, so you should know it's coming. Like, people have been talking about a coronavirus doing this for the last 5 to 10 years and like being really serious about it. And so there's many companies who had this already in their pipeline and were kind of sitting on it and waiting to jump. There's like over 500 drugs being like that have a drug pipeline right now, and I think there's at least 3 or 4 human clinical trials, and there's many more preclinical work going on. And so, I think it's very ready, but I think the real challenge is going to come when it comes down to how to distribute these kinds of medicines or vaccines. It's really up to pharma and government to come together to distribute them, because without a distribution plan, it really comes down to nothing. So all that hard work without a plan to put it into effect, almost, you can't only support half of the population. So
it's interesting that you guys are basically working in those two paired things, right? A government lab at Wadsworth and a pharma company at Evotec, and doing those kinds of things. Do you feel like there are conversations in place to assure that some of those vaccines will get to underserved populations, populations that will sort of get abroad? I sort of threw that one at you, so you can.
Well, I know we work pretty closely with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on various projects, but those are higher level discussions. So I personally am not privy to what my company has in the pipeline, but there's a certain amount of our specific company's business model that's about kind of a little bit of give back with those types of things. But I would say, you can't bankrupt yourself either in your hope to provide. So it does have to be a balance.
Ultimately, I think it falls to the state, whether it's the state, the federal state, or your individual state. New York State, the tests that if you needed an antibody test or you needed the viral test, you could get one for free, and we made sure that was mandated by health insurance companies that could happen. And I think something similar absolutely needs to happen for public health's well-being. So hopefully it does happen.
It's an interesting time, isn't it, to watch, sort of highlights how much we need both pharma and public health. It's important that they work hand in hand. What is an experience that for each of you that you had at Hartwick that you feel best prepared you to respond well to the changes that have been brought on by the pandemic?
So I'll probably make a little joke here. Well, I lived in a suite with 5 other guys in Wilder Hall for 2 years. So being locked in a tiny room with people suited me for preparing life in my house for 10 weeks, 24/7 with my wife.
And your house is probably cleaner than that suite was.
Yeah, to say the least, yeah.
Yeah, that was not a clean place where he lived.
You can go ahead more seriously.
I've always been flexible and interested in trying new things, and so that in and of itself makes me a little bit more adaptable. If you only want to do one thing and that exact thing for your career, then you're kind of out of luck. If your only job you ever wanted to do was sell Girl Scout cookies door to door, then well, you're not doing that right now. So if you're more open to change, then these kind of situations are a little easier to deal with. I mean, personally, I was very lucky. I was already working remotely. Although I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty jealous when Jon got sent home and didn't really have to do anything.
That's not true.
Well, he had to write, but you can only write for so many hours straight a day. So, I mean, he got to spend a lot more time with the kittens than I did, but.
Yeah, and the Hartwick experience was one that, you're allowed to broaden your horizons, and, I didn't come out of Hartwick just a scientist. And so I was able to explore new things, even though it was just while I was locked in my home, and have an appreciation for them, read new books that I had wanted to read for a long time, and be able to appreciate those sorts of things, and those love of things that I picked up while I was at Hartwick. So ultimately, I think the well-rounded experience of Hartwick makes me just a better person. So allows me to enjoy more things, and it made quarantine life a little bit better.
Although they did a class on gardening.
Yes, yeah.
We need that.
That's good. That's good. Were there activities outside of academics at Hartwick that you think were particularly valuable, Lexi, sort of to contributing to your flexibility? You're a flexible person to begin with, but.
Yeah. Well, I was a tennis player. So I always was involved in other activities and, just like to be involved in different groups. I also did, orchesis at Hartwick. And so I think that's all just part of it, It really just comes back to being open-minded and just the love of learning. And that is the reason I chose Hartwick, because I was interested in too many things. So when I went to Hartwick, I thought I was going to be a glass blower and I was going to run a theater production. And then maybe in my spare time, I'd do something crazy with biochemistry. And so luckily enough, I did shuffle everything out by junior year. But it's that kind of atmosphere that, really allows people to touch upon all the things they might be really good at, kind of narrow in, but still keep the breadth of the types of things they like to do within their, their outlook.
Yeah, I agree. And you, Jon?
Oh, well, I was actually really heavily involved in student government while I was at Hartwick, which was actually, a fun experience. getting to work with administrative people and working with the students to sort of coordinate the needs of people, of the student body. And I really enjoyed doing that. And ultimately, that's helped me in my career. Not quite sure how much it helped me during quarantine, but it's definitely allowed me to think more deeply about how I interact with people and how I ultimately get things done, whether it's at work or in my personal life.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's great. So my last question's for Jon. Are there actions you believe that your industry or your work can take to address issues highlighted by the murder of George Floyd?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this is a really, I wish I had like an hour to talk about this. Maybe we will. So yeah, when you see violent acts, caught on tape of police brutality, that's really jarring, obviously. It's something you don't want to see, and it's something that should never happen. But it's called systemic racism for a reason. It's just not pervasive in policing. It's pervasive in every aspect of our society. And I think that universities, colleges, and even the STEM fields, it's very prevalent. Black people are underrepresented in the STEM field. It's not even close. You have a population, some universities, you might have a population of, 30 to 40% Black or minority communities. And you look at a department in the biology department, and there might be one Black professor. And how are those students supposed to feel when, they're looking at their professors and they don't see someone that looks like them? Ultimately, I think that's a really huge issue. And doesn't necessarily mean that we're not properly providing them with the opportunities that they deserve in order to advance their academic careers and their careers ultimately. But that starts well before they all get to college. Urban education systems have been decimated by lack of funding, and ultimately they don't have the resources that they need to be able to be exposed to the sorts of science and all these other wonderful things that the world has to offer. And we need to reverse that. It's incumbent on the people who are in leadership roles now, mostly white people, to listen to these communities, the Black community, and hear what they want, and ask them ultimately how we can make things better and do that together. And I think that starts with scientists like me reaching out to the communities and volunteering time and going and talking to students about opportunities that await them if they're interested in science, get them excited about science, and hopefully just small acts of reaching out and helping people like that can ultimately help students feel like they have a place in STEM and be able to have a career, as lucky as I was. So, and I think that I should be able to provide those opportunities for people.
Fantastic, thanks. That's really great. It's been great for you guys to share. I think Susan's going to start inviting some questions that we might have from our audience members that may have for you as well.
Yeah.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you. But we do already have quite a few questions. So I'd love to delve a little bit deeper if you guys are up for it.
Sure.
Our first question is asking, when did you know that you wanted to pursue careers in science? Was it before Hartwick, while at Hartwick, or afterwards?
Yeah, so yeah, my career choices changed pretty frequently, like Lexi's, while I was at Hartwick. When I went to school, I wanted to be a vet, and then I worked for a vet for a summer, and I was like, wow, this is really horrible. You have to like put animals down. It's something I can't deal with emotionally, which is probably why I work with microorganisms and not mice or anything. And then I sort of wanted to be a writer for a while. I took a lot of English classes, like thought I might want to be like a journalist or something, a sports journalist. And then the turning point was really when I took genetics with Stan Sessions as a sophomore. And I was kind of like having an existential crisis where I was like, man, I don't know what I'm going to do. If I wanted to be a vet and that's not going to work out. And I can't, being a writer is really hard. You don't make any money. And obviously as a scientist, you don't make that much money. But then I was like, Stan was like, oh, well, you can go to grad school, and they pay you to go to grad school. Grad school is free if you're in the STEM field. So I was like, okay, I really like science. I'm really passionate about it. I've always been reading science textbooks since I was a little kid. Loved dinosaurs like every other little boy. And so,
Or girl.
Oh, girl. Yeah, that's true. Sorry. And then, so yeah, it just took off from there. And that one lecture from Stan actually altered the course of my career, actually, which is pretty wild to think about. And yeah, here I am.
Well, for me, it's what point in my life? First, I want to be an architect, and then a chef, which you can see where that that came back in later. So I grew up. My father was a botanist, ornithologist, and my mom was a kindergarten teacher. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a scientist or an artist for most of my life. And just like I said, when I went to Hartwick, I thought I was going to do all of them. And so I showed up, and my advisor was David Griffin in geology, and he has a specialty in paleontology, and it's actually an amazing mix of biology and geology. And so I stuck with geology for a little while. Mostly he was like, you can go to the National Geological Society meeting for free if you declare geology. And I was like, I'm a geology major, and so I got to go to Moab, Utah. But so I eventually, I think some of the classes I enjoyed most were actually, microbiology and obviously genetics. John and I were in a lot of the same classes, although I
don't know what you're trying to say.
Well, we actually met and started dating in vertebrate zoology with Stan Sessions. So
yes.
Love it, first dissected animal.
Yeah, Stan really came up big for me, I guess.
Who made the first moves?
Oh, obviously.
She did.
But I just think there's just something so fluid and forward thinking about science, and it's such an exciting field to be part of. And just because you say I'm a scientist doesn't mean you can't be an artisan baker, because that's also science. And so I've been lucky enough to be part of the scientific community that doesn't judge you for those kind of decisions. Food science, obviously, that's very malleable with, working in the food service industry. And so I've just been kind of lucky to always been encouraged and move throughout career choices that have always felt positive and that I'm making a difference. And so that's the same way I feel now. You're pairing people in industry who, need to get this drug created so that people can overcome these terrible challenges that they have in their life, or world crises and pandemics. And, it's all part of this, greater good atmosphere that's part of science.
Well put. And kind of talking about those weaving of your career, the next questions are very similar in that effect. And one was, has your experiences at Hartwick outside of your major, how did your experience outside of your major prepare you for your careers now? Are there things and likely there's another question that talks about the liberal arts and the education you got as a liberal arts outside of the sciences, those classes that you had to take. How did those kind of influence your career paths?
So yeah, being able to write well is really important for every field, especially science. When you're trying to convince people to give you millions of dollars, you don't want to look like an idiot while you're writing. So yeah, you have to be able to write really well. And I think that a lot of the courses in English really helped me develop my skills as a writer for simply just being able to organize something properly. And being able to discuss something that's very complex, but being able to convey it to someone outside of your field. Those are really important things that you need to be able to do, certainly as a scientist, that you don't learn in a science class, really. So I think that was a really valuable experience at Hartwick, and the liberal arts education ultimately helped me a lot there.
Were there activities you talked about, and I'll go back to you, Lexi, I'm sorry, but while we're still on it, were there certain activities too, like you talked about being part of the government, SGA, that were influential in helping you kind of navigate your career as well? What recommendations would you give to students of what to get involved in?
Oh, well, I mean, certainly for my particular career path, I wanted to ultimately run my own lab. And on some level, you need to be able to have some leadership qualities in order to, be able to run a lab and do it well. You need to be able to take responsibility for everything that happens in the lab, all the design of the experiments, all of the money that's coming in, like everything stops with you. And so being part of any sort of leadership program, I think, is good in helping mold you as a scientist and a leader, not necessarily just like in an academic lab, but even in pharma or business or anything like that. Learning how to be a leader and taking on leadership roles is really important.
So yeah, Lexi, your education, your liberal arts portion and activities that you'd recommend.
So I actually feel like now I'm really pulling on being a Blue Key tour guide because, I spend my days a lot talking to complete strangers. And so there is this certain amount of like a savvy way of getting information from people and giving it back appropriately. And it's a skill that you need to develop. Not everyone can walk up and say, hey, hi, nice to meet you, to a perfect stranger. And so a lot of that, and just feeling comfortable and knowing that it's okay to say, I don't know the answer to that, I'd love to find it for you, and knowing that you don't need to know everything and that you can find the answers and you can pull up the appropriate resources and connect with people.
Yeah, that's awesome. So another question is talking about the cultures of where you work. They're curious about what type of employees are Evotec looking for? Are there certain qualities that they look for in individuals?
So, I mean, in terms of like the lab scientist, it's anyone who's motivated, willing to work hard, not necessarily experienced in the particular field. I joined the assay operations team with no experience in specifically running assays. So those are a lot of the tests they use to determine whether a drug is toxic before moving into animal or cell studies. And so, they were willing to give me a chance because I said, I know the basic techniques of science and I like learning new things. And that's how I got the job, just not being intimidated from learning. And it sounds kind of insane to say, but they kind of took me at my word. And it went, I worked in the lab for over a year before joining the business development team. And the business development team actually sought me out because I'm an outgoing personality. And that's not the norm necessarily in science. And so it's a skill that served me well. Yeah.
Arts in action. That's a great answer. How about you, Jon? We kind of understand higher education, but on the government side, what has been your experience?
In what I'm looking for people?
Yeah, when you're hiring individuals, what are you looking for?
Yeah, I
researchers.
mean, I've gone through a couple rounds of hiring people to come work in my lab, and so in any sort of basic research lab, I think it comes down to basically enthusiasm for what you're studying. If you're able to convey an interest in what I study and a willingness to learn, I think that's one of the most important things that you can do as a scientist, is just be open. I mean, the actual physical doing of science can be difficult at times, but the more important part is being able to actually understand concepts and being open to understanding those concepts and, carrying out experiments to further those concepts. And so you have to be willing to learn those things, but just show up every day and be ready to try something new. And I think that ultimately you'd be pretty successful.
Yeah, I mean, I've been on multiple hiring committees where I'll pick the person with like no actual experience related to what we're hiring for. And I'm like, this person's it. And everyone's like, I don't know. And then we talk about it a little while and then we hire them and they're like, they've stayed, the one guy just left the lab at Cornell that I worked at almost, I guess it's like 8 years ago. So it's really all about being interested in what you're doing, and you may have a skill set that's different from the lab you're joining, and that's an asset. It's not a detriment, and just remembering that.
So sort of following up on that, how much do you guys feel, even sort of, I guess, in your career paths, but also sort of even in your jobs you do now, how often do you feel like you're not really in the moment totally prepared for what faces you, and you have to problem solve, right? You have to figure it out. You have a set of skills that you can call on to figure it out, but you're not just ready to walk in and immediately know what to do.
Yeah. That's me every day. Ultimately, I think that's what my postdoc experience was really great for. I had developed a pretty unique skill set in graduate school, but then I totally changed fields and went and did something else for my postdoc. And having those particular skills that I went with allowed me to fall back on certain things when I did fail, at my new adventure in Bonnie's lab. So yes, I agree. I agree that often in the moment I'm overwhelmed and have no idea what I'm doing. But when you get back and just think calmly and fall back on your expertise, everything ends up falling in place, and ultimately you do learn what you need to learn.
Yeah, I was like 25 to 50% of my day is, oh crap, what is this person talking about? And then researching it for the rest of it, so it's pretty much that all day long. I mean, I became an Excel expert for like a week, learning how to manipulate spreadsheets. So it's something new every day. And if you didn't like doing it, then you'd be out in a week. So.
That's really helpful. You don't have to be perfect. I think that's the best thing. We're always constantly learning, right?
Yeah.
We have another, John, we have a question for you. Did you feel that your Hartwick experience prepared for your graduate school at Cornell?
Yeah, in a lot of respects, I did. I feel like the coursework at Hartwick definitely prepared me well for the next step in terms of what was expected of me in coursework in graduate school, certainly. Like I spoke about earlier, in terms of my skills as a bench scientist probably weren't as great as they should have been. Don't necessarily think that that's Hartwick's fault. And I wish I had taken advantage of some of the things that Hartwick had to offer. But ultimately, I think that my in-classroom education and things that I learned in the lab prepared me really well for graduate school at Cornell.
I feel like John's being a little hard on himself because, I mean, we learned a lot of lab skills, but so his format of grad school was different than mine. Like, I chose a topic, I chose a lab, I went right into it, and I was done in 2 years. And the format of the Cornell grad school is you do rotations. And so you're only in learning about one topic for so many months, and then you're switched to the next person. And so it's all over again. And so you must feel scrambled, relearning all these different techniques until you find out one is the one you'd like to pursue.
And I think one of the things that a lot of my classmates, I felt like they knew what kind of lab they wanted to join. And while I had been exposed to a lot of research at Hartwick, I didn't really have a particular field or an area of research that I was really interested in diving deep into. And luckily, I ended up finding something that I was really passionate about, but that sort of soul searching at Cornell took quite a bit of time and was really anxiety inducing because you think that you're never going to find your place and maybe this isn't right for you. But ultimately, it all worked out. And I think that in large institutions like that, there's going to be something for everyone. So I just really lucked out with my mentor, and it was a really great experience overall.
it's matchmaking. They have to like you too. So.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, graduate school is like a really awkward dating show. Yeah.
I'd want to hang with you, Jon.
Do you guys think some of that soul searching, do you feel like you had to do some of that anxiety soul searching even as an undergrad? It's sort of part of the whole sort of educational exploration piece.
I mean, how many times did I cry in your office, Mary? um, yeah, I mean, all the time. I mean, obviously my career choices are all over the map, so there's a lot of soul searching going on. And a lot of that starts, in undergrad, and that's the benefit of liberal arts is you're allowed to experiment and try new courses. Some of my favorite courses were sociology with Reed Golden, who I saw, he just retired. And like biology almost lost me to letterpress for a while. But it's, coming back to those things that you really feel passionate about and, pursuing it. Like every time I leave the lab, I usually end up going back to the lab. So, I feel very connected to scientists and bench scientists. Oh, and there's one here too, I guess, but.
Well, talking about the sciences, your passions, what do you miss? We have a question here that asks, what do you miss about the research and doing business now on the business side of things? And, how do you see your career playing out in the future? Lexi.
You want to tell them your career goals that you had at...
Oh, wait, I picked up. So I'm taking a sales training class. And one of them was like, you should define your personal goals before your professional goals. So it sounds terrible to say. I just pinned like up on my board, retire at 50. So, and plant an inner city orchard and have a large sustainable garden. So defining those goals first prior to my professional goals. I don't know. I'm losing track of what I'm talking about.
You have to be able to relate like what your personal goals are with what your career goals are and make sure that they meet.
Yeah.
And I will say that, going through some personal struggles, it's really hard to focus on, what makes me happy, what do I want to do? And I think for me, it's the constant learning. Like if I get bored, I'm out. And so that's definitely not the case right now. And I'm not ready to leave the BD team because business development is development of the business, and the business I'm in is science. And so I work with a really great group of very passionate individuals. And by the way, I'm probably the least educated of them. Most of them have PhDs, have worked in the lab for, 2 to 10 years prior to joining the team. And so there's just as much to gain there versus being a lab scientist. And I will say the other times I've left the bench have obviously been for very different types of activities. And now I have a house with a nice oven so I can bake bread at home.
What are you baking these days?
Lots of scones.
Yeah.
We have one more question, and it's to Jon. They're curious about how you balance everything from being a professor to doing research and working at the Department of Health.
Yeah. So this is actually a really great question. I'm glad someone asked it because it was something that I had a really hard time dealing with when I was at Princeton. Demands were really high, in terms of being able to do the research, things going on in my personal life that were difficult to deal with. And ultimately, the piece of advice that I got from one of my mentors was you have to embrace the imbalance or find balance in the imbalance. Just because one day you're committed to working 16 hours on an experiment doesn't mean that you have to let it ruin your tomorrow and your personal life or something else that you want to do. So it's ultimately like a live in the moment type thing. But like when you have a goal that you want to reach, you focus on that and hopefully complete it and then move on to the next thing. So, you know, as someone who runs a lab, as someone who teaches and has other sorts of, you know, personal activities that I like to engage in, you know, it is difficult to be able to find the balance and what the right balance is. But, you know, some days you have to make a sacrifice and you can't do something that you want to do, but then you need to know to make time for that in at least the near future. So, you know, if I work a crazy 16-hour day one day, I try to only work like 4 hours the next day and find joy in something else that I can do and spend time with Alexis and the cats and, I don't know, go cut down a tree or something. Yeah. So yeah, you have to find balance in the imbalance.
If you were going to give one sentence of advice we'll close with this, one sentence of advice to students right now who are interested in entering your field, what would you give them? What would that advice be?
Don't steal from Nike.
Yeah, so I would just say find something that excites you and just dive right into it. There's so many opportunities out there. Just keep asking, keep looking, and you'll find one.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Just pursue your interests.
Yeah.
It's kind of, you know, it's a little different for everyone, you know. So science is just such a broad field. So lots for people to like about it.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Is there any other questions from the audience?
I have one, I think one last one. I'm going to take us back a little bit because Lexi mentioned sociology and I wondered if there was either an experience or a course at Hartwick that you didn't deliberately stumble into, that you didn't deliberately do, but you stumbled into, you know? And you stumbled into that experience, that course, and it really was impactful for you in a way that surprised you.
I mean,
Yeah.
For me, it really was just taking I think it was just Sociology 101. And there was this exercise that was use like the Social Security payment or like what someone would have to live off from the government and try to pay all of your bills. And I was like, this is impossible. And then I was talking to my mom about it on the phone and she's like, oh, I got this, no problem. I was a single mom because my mom, I'm the product of a second marriage, right? And so I had never had this conception of, you know, my family struggling. And it really brings it home that, you know, not everything's, you know, unicorns and rainbows, and you really have to think outside of the, you know, the box. You know, in college, you're in this bubble where you can really take the time to explore your interests and kind of relax, you know, and study. But, you know, not everyone gets that opportunity, and it's something that you really need to take advantage of because it's a privilege, and, you know, you should use it to the best of your ability so that you can, you know, give back. You know, the more productive you are, the more you're able to give back and have lots of cats. But be a, you know, contributing member of your community. Yeah.
So for me, it was actually, it's kind of related to the George Floyd question. It was J-term, and it was like approaching, and I wasn't going abroad, and I had nothing planned. But I took a course called Slavery in America with Professor Matthews. And I was the only white kid in the class. And it was really the first time in my life where I, you know, wasn't the predominant race in, you know, in a classroom setting. And it was really, you know, a very intellectually stimulating class. I learned a lot. I also learned ultimately what it kind of feels like to not, you know, look like everyone else around you. But yeah, ultimately that was one of the most important classes I think that I took, especially outside of the sciences, and learning about things like the Tulsa riots and Juneteenth and like things that are commonplace now that are being talked about, but I got to learn about, you know, 12 years ago because I had one of the, rare cases of actually having a African-American professor.
He had quite the following too.
So.
Yeah, I went on a trip with a group that he was like the advisor for to Six Flags, and my friends and I were the only white people on that trip, and so that really drives home why it's so important to have representations of people so they can see themselves in their future, because obviously that was very important.
Yeah, Harry's a special guy.
Yeah.
Special guy. So yeah, thanks you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
On behalf of the college, I just really want to add my thanks, Professor Mary Ellen, our wonderful alumna and alumnus, Lexi Andrus, class of 08, and Jon Paczkowski, class of 08, and to all of our guests who joined us this evening. Thank you so much. We hope you'll join us again for our next network chat on Sunday evening. Have a good night and stay safe.